Saltwater Stories, The Wreckage of the Markham, A True Story of the Nantucket Shoals, by Edwin Fisk Kimball. So you want to hear my roughest experience in saving lives from wrecks? Well, there are a good many stories of hard pulls and narrow escapes I might tell you. But I think the Markham scrape was the closest call we ever had. For over 20 hours, it was a struggle between life and death, and I hardly like to go back and think of it. However, it may help you city men to understand our life here. Watching in storms for vessels in distress along this dangerous coast, and going out in boats to rescue the poor fellows aboard. So draw your chair up closer to the fire, and I'll spin the yarn for you. The speaker was a grand specimen of manly vigor, the keeper of one of Nantucket life-saving stations, a man 6'4" in height, broad-shouldered, muscular, with fearless eyes, and a weather-beaten face. A man whose form and bearing revealed the born hero, however modest his words. I was to spend the night at the station, and now supper having been eaten and 2 of the coast patrols having started out, the keeper and 4 of his surfmen, hardy, athletic fellows, sat round the blazing fire of driftwood, chatting quietly of their adventures. At last the captain thawed out from his reserve and began his story. It happened a year ago this January, during a spell of terribly cold and heavy weather. For 2 or 3 days a fierce northwester had been blowing, and daybreak that morning the keeper of the San Katie Light, 6 miles down the shore, telephoned up to me that he had seen torches burning the evening before directly out to sea, and I asked him to look out sharp for a wreck as soon as the light came. Just after sunrise he telephoned again, and he could see 3 masted schooner stranded on a shoal about 6 or 7 miles to the eastward and apparently all out of water. He was deceived as to the distance by the early eastern light, for it afterward proved that she was 12 miles away from the lighthouse. We could see nothing of the vessel from our lookout, and could not have seen her even in clear weather, for she was off on Great Rip Shoal, formerly known as the Rose and Crown, about 16 miles southeast of our station. We went 5 miles toward her before we got a glimpse of her masts. Let's begin at the beginning. As soon as I received word of the wreck, I hurried the men down to breakfast, and while they were eating I seized up the chances of our going out in the gale and getting back. First I felt sure that the vessel must be out on Great Rip, double the distance reported, as there was nothing else I knew of which would have her up so out of the water. The sky was hard, black, and doubtful. The sea was ugly and rough, and bad weather must hold on a good while longer. Snow squalls had occurred in the night, and might occur again. 3 of my regular crew of 6 surfmen were away sick with the grip, and their place had been taken by men of little experience and lacking in weight and strength. I well knew it was a big risk to go out so far, and yet it was no satisfaction to me that on account of the distance the government could not blame me if I did not go. So I weighed well the chances for and against. I thought that if the crew of the schooner or any of them had lived through this bitter night, there was little hope of passing vessel saving them, for captains kept far to the eastward of the shoal. So if they were to be rescued, it must be from our station. Should I choose to take the risk? But could we get back to shore in the teeth of a wind blowing now and then 30 and 50 miles an hour? Even if we could make headway against it, some great wave might swamp us, especially if heavily loaded with the rescue crew. Could we get back? That was the question. It was hard to decide, I can tell you. If I did not go, some of my fellow men, possibly out there, were yet alive, and would certainly perish. Their wives would be made widows, and their children lose protectors and fathers. Mothers, sisters, suffer grief. Yet to go might mean death for ourselves and sorrow for our dear ones. I had recently married, and my little wife and my old mother needed my support and love. All this flashed through my head faster than I can talk it. But think as I would, I couldn't get over the thought of the wreck and the crew there on the shoal. And by the time breakfast was finished, my mind was made up to go, and I told the boys to dress warm and start. I decided to try it with the surf boat rather than take the heavy lifeboat, which would be harder to row back against the gale, and as it proved, I made the right choice. Still, the surf boat, you know, is only a large dory, 23 feet long, likely to be swamped, especially if heavily loaded, whereas the lifeboat gives plenty of room and is more stable. But I knew we could not pull her back, so I took the surf boat. We hitched out our horses to the boat carriage and quickly crossed over to the outside beach, launched the boat into the surf, and were off by 8 o'clock for our perilous trip. I forgot to tell you that before leaving the station I telephoned over to town to have a steam tug telegraph for, and if one could be found anywhere on Vineyard Sound, to have it come out and meet us. It was not at all certain that one would be found in harbor, and I took the chance it might not. As I learned afterwards, they did catch one at Vineyard Haven, and it went out around Gay Head and 5 miles out to sea, but the captain either saw something of a wreck or didn't. But the captain either saw nothing of a wreck or didn't dare to go farther, thinking he could not get back, so turned and went home. I ordered the mast and sail put up, and we drove rapidly towards the shoal, where I supposed the wreck to be. We found the compass out of the order and useless, but wouldn't let that turn us back. I thought, if it came to the worst, we could take a northern tide, and get to one of the light ships which lay up towards Cape Cod, and to be taken aboard. After running 5 miles southeasterly, we made out to see her masts away off on the horizon, over 10 miles away. Should we keep on and risk that return? A little lifting of the clouds in the northwest seemed an answer, and we let her drive on. Wind and tide were in our favor, and in 3 hours from starting, or at 11 o'clock, we drew near. Now we saw men clinging to the fore rigging, and at last counted 7 in all. The sea was breaking on and over the vessel terribly, both under the bow and stern and on the ocean side. She was now filling, for her bow was nearly gone, and she had tipped landward, so her bulwark were level with the water. The heavy swell and its fierce rebound made it impossible to go alongside to take off the crew, for if our boat had been thrown on the bulwark, she would have been smashed like an eggshell. The men in the rigging were stiff with the cold, and so nearly exhausted by their 15 hours in the blinding spray, and we knew we must work fast if we could save them. So at a good distance from the wreck, I ordered the anchor let go, the sail and mast taken down, and the oars put out, and then we backed and drifted stern foremost towards the vessel, I using the steering oar. The northern tide, which had now begun to flow, swept us in towards the wreck, and after 3 or 4 attempts, I managed with a heaving stick to throw a line into the fore-rigging where the men clung. I told them to tie on the heavy line which dangled near them, and which I directed to be cut clear. This they did, and we pulled their line to our boat and fastened it under a thwart near the bow. Now occurred something which always happens when men brought so near death as they. The poor fellows were nearly crazy from exposure, and the prospect of rescue, they began pulling on the line to bring our boat closer alongside so that they could jump in. They could not realize that their lives and ours also depended on keeping the boat a safe distance from the vessel. As they hauled us nearer, I shouted and reasoned and threatened, but in vain. They had lost all judgment, so I passed the long boat knife up to the bow oarsman and hollered to the vessel that if they hauled another foot, I should order the line cut, and would leave them to their fate, unless they quickly did as I told them. They looked at the knife in my man's uplifted hand, and then at me, and knew I meant what I said, and stopped pulling. I ordered them to tie the line fast and wait. They were now under more control, and yet to avoid the danger of a scramble, which might either upset the boat or cause the loss of one of their lives, I ordered them up the rigging, telling them I should take them one at a time, the weakest first, that if they made a rush, I would order the line cut, which held us to the vessel, and wait till they could obey orders, if I had to lie there till night. My firm speech and manner calmed them, and they fell back. Then I threw another line, and told them to make a running bowline knot in it, and put it around a certain man under his arms, then to wait for my word to push him towards us. I swung the boat in with my oar, 2 of my men holding the line, which was tied round the man, and another one round to ease off the line which held us to the vessel. Then, when a great swell lifted us towards the vessel, I gave the word, and pushed and pulled. The man came flying through the air right into the boat, yet caught and stopped by our waiting arms. I pointed out the next man, and we got him in the same way, so on in each turn till all were landed in the boat. Though it was a long jump, yet by careful waiting for the right swell, and by quick jerking on the line at the exact moment, 6 of them were taken without touching the water. The other man missed the boat, but came a second later, rolling over the gunwale like a great fish. So great was the force of his jump and our pull. The captain was the last man to leave his vessel. He was made of good stuff. After we got ashore, and we could talk, he told us how his vessel had been blown on the shoal a heavy squall about 7 o'clock the evening before. He had lost his reckoning in the thick weather, and thought he was far to the eastward. His vessel was the H.P. Markham, bound from Halifax to New York, with pickled fish and laths and cargo worth $25,000. He was sole owner of the vessel, only 6 months built, and not much insured. It was the only trip in her on which he had not taken his wife and children, who, if on board that awful night, must have been either washed off or frozen to death. When the vessel struck, he knew how hopelessly they were placed, but decided to try a bright torch, which might be seen by some passing vessel. So he ordered the dazed crew to get an empty kerosene barrel, knock it in its head, and place it on the after house. Then, putting some old newspapers in it, he lighted them, and the oil which had soaked into the wood flamed up light and bright. At any rate, those rays of light traveled across the dark waters into the light-housekeeper's eyes 12 miles away, and his voice, traveling along a telephone wire next morning, had started us out to save them. Life hangs on small threads sometimes, you see. You will scarcely believe it, but when the captain saw us approaching, he felt only sorry. He said he told his mate, too bad, 7 more men will die sure. They can never get back in this gale alone, or with us on the boat. We are nearly dead anyway. Brave fellows, but why did they come? Too bad, 14 to die instead of 7. How did it come out, you ask? Let's see, where was I? Oh, we had just got the poor fellows all off onto the boat. We had been 20 minutes about it, held from dashing against the vessel by our anchor and a rope no bigger than my thumb. It was a ticklish place and a ticklish job while it lasted, but our troubles had only just begun. There we were in an open boat out of sight of land, likely to be carried on to the shoal or off to sea when we took up anchor. We hove up the anchor, though, for the pull-in, and now the men strained at the oars so as to clear the vessel and the shoal. Both wind and tide were setting us on the awful breakers. It was only by the most desperate efforts that we succeeded in keeping off and clearing the northern end of the shoal. For 2.5 hours we strained every nerve, but were only a mile away from the wreck, yet not a bit farther toward shore. While we were nearest the breakers, and when the issue was doubtful, the mast and sail, which laying on thwarts, bothered the oarsmen, were, by my orders, thrown overboard, and we rowed a little lighter. Then we were all that time in great danger of being swamped by some big wave rolling up upon us, unless we could head the boat to it just right. I stood in the stern all through the 23 hours before we got ashore, holding the steering oar, fearing to drop it lest some sudden yawn of the boat would end us forever. As the men were getting exhausted and we had gained nothing, we threw the anchor over, and with the shoal a little way to the southeast, lay there from 2 o'clock till sunset at 5. Only a few strands of hemp and the fluke of a small anchor. My friend kept us from going into the open sea and watery graves. At dark the southern tide began to run, and I ordered the anchor up and started again, with the hope that the tide would set us a little in toward shore, provided we could by hard rowing hold the bow up to the wind and prevent the boat from going astern. We worked hard and gained a little, but by 9 o'clock the tide was done, and in half an hour or an hour afterward we again anchored and lay through the northern tide, or till 3 o'clock the next morning. Oh, that night! Those 5 hours seemed like weeks. It was pitch dark, the wind increasing in force, and the air bitter cold. Most of the rescue crew, after being got on board, had lain in the bottom of the boat like so many logs. They were numb with cold, soaked through with salt spray, faint from hunger and lack of sleep, and so exhausted and indifferent that they would not eat the little bread we had thrown aboard. Their cook, who was asleep in his bunk when the vessel struck, had only a calico shirt and trousers on. Before we reached land, the back of that shirt was covered 4 inches thick from ice from the water which dashed upon him while rowing, for he was a brave fellow and worked at the oars for many hours during the tough pull for shore. During those times I had made all I could persuade man the oars by telling them that, though they had got clear of the vessel, they were by no means saved, and unless they helped, we should never get in, but all die in the boat. Some I could do nothing with, as they seemed to have lost all hope of life. One man sat on the midship thwart like a stone image. In vain I pleaded and threatened. He would not stir. I told him he would freeze to death, that though he had no strength to help us on, the exercise of pulling would start his blood and keep him alive. His only reply was a shake of the head, and I can't be any colder. Poor fellow! The next day, when we got him ashore, his feet were found frozen, and they swelled to twice their natural size. The captain, since sunset, had lain near me, crouched up under the steering oar. It was all I could do to hold the boat head on, and the oar thrashed so that I couldn't prevent it striking the captain as he rolled around. The boat was so heavily loaded that it was deep in the water, and when we settled in the hollow of the seas, The water gushed up through the center board box, and our lives depended on constant bailing. I kept the poor fellows hard at it with buckets, yet it took my utmost effort to keep them to work. I told them we should soon sink if they did not bail, but that had little effect, so I fairly forced them. They were now inclined to go to sleep, and we had to arouse them continually to keep awake, but badly off as they were, it was lucky they were with us, and not on the vessel, because half an hour after we left her, the mast fell, and the sea round was strewn with wreckage. About midnight, the thing I most feared happened. One of my surfmen, a little light fellow named Jenkins, began to give out. While alongside the wreck, two great seas coming from different directions had met, and shooting up into the air, had dashed upon him, soaking him through and through. He was crying every now and then, "Oh, I never was so cold in my life." He soon lay down, and in spite of our efforts to the contrary, went to sleep, a fatal sleep, for the exposure of that trip in the boat caused his death last June. While Jenkins was so sick, one of the rescued crew was taken with cramps, and his moans were pitiful to hear. All this was rather discouraging, but not one of my crew winced. They were heroes, every one. They knew the peril we were in. To show you how coolly they took it, I remember that one of them, after watching the conditions of things for an hour after we anchored at 10 o'clock, and said, "I don't see as I am of much account about this time," and taking a bucket, squatted on it in the bottom of the boat, and went sound asleep. Another of my men, after arranging as comfortably as he could some heavy coats and tarpaulins about the little fellow who was sick, hauled a coat over him off his own back, and went to sleep also. Did I sleep? Well, you can believe I didn't. I felt that the lives of all depended on my watchfulness and decisions. But I haven't told you about 10 o'clock that night. From the constant straining of my sight against such a wind and spray, my left eye, after 2 hours of severe pain, gave out entirely. It didn't recover its sight until the next day, after our return, when sleep seemed to cure the trouble. When my eye gave out, knowing how much depended on my sight and direction, I was quite disheartened, but as I had determined to save all hands if I could, I just braced myself the harder and pulled through. A man thinks pretty fast in a tight place like that, and I don't care to go through it but once. At 3 next morning, the southern tide again made, and we got under way and worked slowly toward shore. It was still dark, and 2 bad shoals, Bass Rip and Old Man's, lay somewhere ahead. We might run upon them before we knew it and be lost, or a kind providence might guide us to one side over them in some deep enough place. How we got by Bass Rip we never shall know, but we either went north of it or through one of its sloughs. It was anxious work, but we rode on. The only guide we had that long, dreary night was the flash of the Sankaty light, which, when we started from our last anchorage, was scarcely visible, but which grew brighter and brighter as we went on. Our hopes grew with its welcome flash, and daylight found us encouraged. Still we were far from shore, and made slow progress. The men were nearly worn out, and could not row much longer. The wind as we neared the shore moderated a little, or we should have been obliged to anchor to prevent our being carried by the tide on to Old Man Shoal, or out by its southerly to sea. Fortunately, we could not gain a good deal toward shore. As we drew slowly in, the people gathered on the bluffs and beach to watch us. Soon willing hands had caught our warp and carried it up the sand, and were hauling us in over the surf. We were on land at last, and all alive, and I can tell you we were glad of it. The kind people of the little village soon had us in their houses, and our frozen clothing was removed, and we were quickly put into warm beds. We could hardly stay awake long enough to drink the hot soup or gruel. When I awoke, I found my wife at my bedside. She had been wildly anxious all the while, and had had little hope of our return. She had gone down the 6 miles to Sankaty Light, and stayed all night with the keeper and his wife, watching and waiting. Their kindness to her in her distress, she says she can never forget. Well, she was glad to see me, and I to see her, and I could not blame her tears. Life is worth living, and the worst or the best of us will make a struggle to hold on to it while there is faintest hope. As we had landed nearly 8 miles south of our station, we sent for our horses and the boat carriage before we went to sleep. And it was 10 o'clock in the afternoon then, and by the middle of the afternoon we started to return to our station, and by 5 o'clock we were back there, after an absence of 33 hours, 26 of which were spent in the open boat. After supper I told the boys to go on patrol again as usual. I suppose you know the fuss they are planning to make in Nantucket town over this scrape of ours. No? Well, the United States inspector at Boston got hold of our story and told the superintendent of service that something ought to be done for us. So a lot of gold medals have been obtained from the Treasury Department, and the inspector now has them. He's coming down some day this month to have them presented with a good deal of speech-making in the church. I'm sorry that little Jenkins won't be there. His medal will be given to his old mother, and she will prize it, I can tell you. Yes, we're glad enough to take our medals, but you may believe we didn't have time to think of such things when we were in the scrape a year ago. But because of the captain and his crew, as soon as they were able to travel, they were sent home to Halifax by the good people over in town, who raised a snug sum of money for them and started them off in good shape. Well, it's time to turn in, boys. Good night, friend. Yes, I will show you that surf boat in the morning.